I'd like to welcome the participants in the 2020 edition of the Social Policy for Development Planners course, with the twist of in the context of COVID-19 pandemic to this particular module. This is the first module, which is concerned with a reflection on development, um, and then we'll explore the principles and political economy of development planning. The purpose of Module 1 in the Social Policy for Development Planners in the context of COVID-19 course is to introduce the participants to the evolving ideas of development and the significant differences in contemporary ideas of development and the principles and the political economy of development planning. The emphasis of this module is on why development as the structural transformation of economy and society with a focus on improved manufacturing capacity is still very essential for African countries. And the COVID-19 pandemic further reinforces the imperative of enhancing the manufacturing capacity, mastery of technology, state capacity, and equity of access to health and education services. It's important to keep in mind that structural transformation is not an end in itself. Its value is measured by the extent to which it expands human capability and functioning in the framework provided by Amartya Sen. It is the extent to which it is inclusive, democratic, and sustainable in terms of the use of Earth's resources. The model serves as a background for the primary focus of the course, which is on the social policy concerns for development planners. By the end of the module, we will expect you to have developed a further appreciation for the importance of development planning and implementation for deepening national economic capacity, enhancing social equity, and improving human well-being. The idea of development as a planned process of economic and social change, which involves the articulation of different sectors of the economy and society in improved productive capacity, social functioning, and human well-being, it is important to keep in mind is a product of post-Second World War period. For a considerable period until the 1980s, and since the mid-2000s, this involved the production of comprehensive development plans with a strategic plan objective in view, broken down into 5-year plans. The strategic plan often involves a long-term vision, usually set within a 35-year to 30-year frame. This is then broken down into 5-year rolling plans. While this idea of development plan and planning became prevalent in the period after the Second World War, they have antecedents in a similar approach to development planning in the Soviet Union in the form of 5-year plans that started in 1928. These efforts generally involve the attempts to combine growth with structural transformation of economy and society. More generic is the antecedent of the idea of development and planning in the notion of progress. Within the development studies literature, The idea of progress and the coordination of efforts to have mastery over what will have been disparate efforts in society and the economy are generally considered the antecedents of the notion of development. The period of the European Renaissance, especially with the flowering, the emergence of mercantilism, and its twinning with secularism, produced the reinterpretation of Aristotle's idea of civic perfection. Unlike the period up to the Middle Ages, where human perfection relied on engagement with the divine being, the idea of civic perfection involved a more secular account of progress. So rather than rather than the earlier notion of human perfection as a product of the purity of motives of individuals, the emphasis for this more secular take on the idea of progress increasingly became one of doing the maximum good and one's relationship with other human beings. As with the earlier Aristotelian approach, education was considered the primary medium for improving human capacity. This was coupled with the privileging of the emerging science and scientists in framing the epitome of human perfection and the notion of progress. In the late Renaissance period to the post-Renaissance era, in the 19th century, for instance, history, rather than mere civic education, was considered the guarantor of progress. The immanence of history of a perpetual movement to a higher level of progress became entrenched in what would become modern European thought. Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection, for instance, became a dominant mode of explaining the improvement over the long journey of different species. Karl Marx's idea of dialectical materialism saw in the long run of history the relentless improvement in the organization of production in society and of society itself. In the different emerging disciplines, for instance, in sociology and economics, the idea developed of a historically driven evolutionary progress. In the field of sociology, this social evolution was understood and presented as a historical progression around which a hierarchy of society was created. The French philosopher, sociologist Auguste Comte argued that society evolved from conquest to defense and then to industry. In the hands of Lewis Morgan, the 19th century American anthropologist, society evolved from savagery to barbarism and to civilization. For Émile Durkheim, the French sociologist, the idea was a binary between the traditional society and the modern society. For Max Weber, the German social scientist, the shift was between traditional and rational society, a change from society ruled by traditional norms to those governed by what we call rationality. For Ferdinand Tönnies, another German scholar, the shift, similar to Durkheim, was from Gemeinschaft or community, where social relations between individuals is based on close personal and family ties, to Gesellschaft or society, in which social relations are based on impersonal ties and links. The idea of development as a shift from traditional society framed by what is called ascriptive ties. In other words, personal ties, ascriptive orientation based on one's social location defined by birth. In other words, things that are attributed to you on the basis of your social standing, which is defined by birth, to a modern society which is supposed to be based on rational rules and achievement orientation. In other words, that which one is able to achieve by oneself, rather than the accident of one's birth, will come to define the core elements of the modernization school in development studies. In economics, the idea of progress under consideration is evident in Adam Smith's implicit notion that progress derives from mercantilist accumulation and reinvestment. However, it was in Karl Marx's idea of the history of successive modes of production rather than the evolution as a historically driven progression of society will become more explicitly stated. Society is supposed to have evolved from primitive communalism to slavery to feudalism to capitalism to socialism and then finally to communism. A unique difference in Marx's teleology of human evolution is in the stages beyond capitalism. The developments in the methods of organizing production and social relations of production are for Marx the determinants of his historical progress. In much of this thinking about historically mediated social evolution, society is understood as becoming, a natural order of social progression. Central to the thinking is that the European society of their times was at the top of the human evolutionary ladder. In the modernization school's take on development, Euro-American society became the target towards which countries of the underdeveloped or developing world are supposed to evolve. Development was presented as a process of becoming like, in other words, becoming like the West. Development becomes a process of emulation of the West in the structure of the economy, social institutions, in the normative orientation of society, and in the value systems of that society. However, between the 19th and the 20th century, the idea of progress took on the form of an outcome of deliberate, planned process and intervention, rather than simply a naturally occurring historical process. Two illustrative cases are the industrialization project in Germany in the 19th century and the project of mitigating the boom and bust cycle of capitalism under the rubrics advanced by John Maynard Keynes. Industrialization in Germany from 1870 was concerned with catch-up with Britain and involved deliberate state interventions and policies intended to stimulate industrialization and the social process and economic progress. The German economist Friedrich List will counsel his country against the free market ideas that others like Britain were championing and advocating instead the use of tariff to protect local industry. In response to the economic and social consequences of the Great Depression of 1929 to 1933, Keynes, for instance, advocated deliberate public efforts of demand-side management involving social regulation of the economy to prevent the boom and bust cycle that led to the Great Depression. Welfare spending, for instance, especially in terms of cash transfers in cash, and increased public spending in the periods of economic downturn involves stimulating demand for products and services, which in turn sustains the production activities and then prevents unemployment and the collapse of businesses. So we shift now the focus from the idea of progress specifically to the idea of development. Development as the coordination of public efforts at defining, collating, deploying resources, steering an economy towards achieving set visions of the desired states that an economy and a society aspires to. As we indicated earlier, it's mostly a phenomenon of the post-Second World War period. The idea of development has multiple heritages. One derives from the concerns in Latin America with the failure to develop, even after a century of independence from Spain and Portugal in the early 19th century. The other has to do with what was considered the success of the Soviet Union in achieving rapid industrialization, especially coming from being a predominantly agrarian rural society. A noted enabler of such rapid industrialization in the case of Soviet Union was supposed to be the 5-year development plans that, as I mentioned earlier on, were initiated from 1928. A final source of the inspiration for development, and this concerns us, as deliberate and programmatic efforts that arose from the concerns of most countries that were emerging from colonialism in addressing what is called the problem of backwardness. One attempt to explain Latin America's lack of development derived from Western anthropological tendencies to explain the lack of development. This often draws from colonial narratives of the distinction between developed and backward people in moral and psychological terms. Such anthropological explanations claim that Latin America failed to develop because its people were ostensibly beset by backward mentality. Another school of thought, from Raúl Prebisch to the dependency school, for instance, sought an explanation in terms of the crisis of the way in which and the mode of insertion of Latin America into the global economy. From 1920 on, Raúl Prebisch, for instance, explained this mode of insertion in terms of Latin America being largely a producer and exporter of primary commodities and an importer of finished industrial products, as well as capital goods. The terms of trade tends to negatively affect the exporters of primary commodities over time. There's what Prebisch will call a secular decline in terms of trade. In other words, the prices of primary commodities relative to imported industrial products. The primary producer will need to produce more of the same good to buy the same amount of industrial goods. Endogenous industrialization was the way, they will argue, to extricate the countries from the conditions of the adverse insertion into the global economy. This will require deliberate efforts at stimulating industrialization, starting with import substitution industrialization. The success of Soviet-planned process of rapid industrialization of the 1930s with the instrument of defined economic objectives, mobilization of resources for achieving the targets, provided the impetus for the idea that development can be planned and deliberately engineered within a limited time frame. The immediacy and urgency of the development concern evolved out of the aspiration of countries emerging from decades of colonialism to overcome the socio-economic backwardness. In other words, overcome the challenges of poverty, ignorance, and disease. In the African context, this was framed by the anti-colonial slogan of a better life for all, within the context of rapid efforts at catch-up and so on. It embeds this notion of development, embeds expanded human well-being in the project of rapid economic and social transformation. Over the years, the idea of development has proliferated in terms of their meanings and content. Riggs, for instance, identified as a 1984 Riggs identified 72 different uses of the term. The dominant ones include the idea of development as economic growth and modernization, development as the elimination of dependency, development as increased welfare and human development, of capacity building and people-centeredness. We have the idea of development as ecologically suitable development. This has evolved into the emphasis on what we may call a green route to development. Other uses of development emphasize local history and cultural autonomy, compliance with globalization, and a focus on reliance on the markets in the allocation of resources became a dominant perspective in the late 1980s to the mid 2000s. In this particular regard, economic growth simply became a substitute for economic development. Although it's important to emphasize that for development planners, economic growth is not the same thing as development, because economic growth refers to simply quantitative improvements in aggregate demand. So if you're producing petroleum, crude oil, or cocoa, or coffee, and in year one, you produce X metric tons of this product, and year two, you produce X metric plus 100. That's a quantitative growth, but there has been no change to the structure of the economy. But a different strand in the development studies literature is from those who call for simple abandonment of the idea of development entirely, which we may call the anti-development discourse. In the early 20th, 21st century, we can speak of two dominant takes on the idea of development. There is the international development perspective that dominates the policies and the thinking of bilateral and multilateral actors. And this perspective, as framed by the actors, often generally referred to as donors, abandoned the pursuit of structural transformation of the economy in the 1980s, especially as this relates to industrialization. The neoliberal attacks on industrial policy underpin this particular shift. Within this framework, development has come to mean a focus on what we may call a relief of extreme poverty. Thandika Mkandawire, for instance, noted that this idea of international development is grounded in the moral premise of helping distant strangers. This take on development contrasts significantly with the yearnings within the developing countries themselves in terms of an approach to development that is often referred to as being framed by the Bandung spirit. And this refers to the inspiration behind the 1955 Asian African Solidarity Conference of 1955 that was held in Bandung, Indonesia from 18th to 24th April. The Bandung Conference initiative will subsequently frame South-South cooperation and initiate such as Afro-Asian People's Solidarity Organization, the Non-Aligned Movement, and the campaign in the late 60s and 1970s into the 80s for a new international economic order. A current conception of development animated by the Bandung spirit is the African Union's Agenda 2063, which we will deal with in a separate module. The Asian or African countries that assembled in Bandung in Indonesia in 1955, most of whom were just emerging from colonialism, were driven by their opposition to colonialism, the pursuit for equitable world order, and mutual respect in the conduct of international affairs. Development within this framework involved the structural transformation of economy and society, the mastery of technology for overcoming backwardness, improving the well-being of their population, and the development as a guarantor of their sovereignty. Catch-up in this context was not a question of being like the West. It requires learning from development pioneers without engaging in mimicry. It requires considerable efforts at knowing oneself and grounding a nation's development trajectory on its history. It involves a significant investment in a country's knowledge system, an argument that Thandika Mkandawire made eloquently in his 2010 2011 paper, Running While Others Walk. In its current form, this idea of development can be defined as structural transformation plus. Development has to be inclusive and democratic and involve the responsible and sustainable use of Earth's resources. The path to a democratic and inclusive development raises the immediate issue of social policy. In particular, a transformative social policy approach in creating synergistic relationship between social and economic policies. Equity and inclusivity here will serve as a guarantor of a stable development process.